when you're preparing an audition, you spend so much time playing music under tempo in fragments at varying tempos or doing exercises related to music. Whereas when you're in a band full time, you're listening to pieces that in real time, you're involved playing pieces in real time all the way through several times a week, all day, every day. Having a sense of musical flow is something that I feel like is elusive to a lot of people who are struggling in audition.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I'm so glad to have you here today. And visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on here. I love to hear from you. I love hearing people's stories. So reach out, send me an email, feedback@contrabassconversations.com. That would be great. And I know you're going to love today's episode featuring Kevin Brown, who's the principal bassist of the Detroit Symphony. And Kevin's also a Minnesota native. He grew up not too far from where I grew up in Minnesota. I grew up just across the border in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So Kevin and I talk about all kinds of topics. This was an epic interview, so many great takeaways. We talk about how Kevin started the bass at age 3, how starting young seems to help with performance anxiety for a lot of people by building in early wins. We talk about studying with Peter Lloyd in early college, how listening to excerpts like Ein Heldenleben while doing stretches helped become a musician rather than just a bass player, and just living a musical life and what that really means rather than just living life as a bass player. We dig into long-term audition preparation, making breakthroughs by only choosing to meet your own standards, becoming a musical scholar, advice that Alex Hanna, who's the current Chicago Symphony principal bassist and past Detroit Symphony principal bassist, the advice that Alex gave to Kevin as Kevin was getting ready to do a trial for that orchestra. Advice that Kevin would give for his 23-year-old self, and also an interesting conversation about playing incidental solos in the orchestra and how that's actually the closest Kevin's come to having that feeling of playing an audition. You'll also hear some excerpts of Kevin playing the Vanhal Concerto with the Detroit Symphony, as well as some excerpts of solo Bach playing. I'd also like to take a moment and thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings. And I'd love to have you get into our giveaway for these first few months of 2017. D'Addario is going to be giving away a set of the orchestra, pizzicato, and hybrid strings. You can enter that at contrabassconversations.com/strings. And I'd like to take a moment and just mention the hybrid strings, which I used for years. They're great pizzicato strings and are also great for the bow. In fact, they seem to work better on the particular bass I had for arco playing than just the orchestral strings. They're really well balanced. They've got nice sustain, but they are also excellent under the bow. Larry Grenadier uses them. Daniel Kimbrough, who I just interviewed for the podcast, I'm going to be putting that out. He uses them. Barry Bales uses them. They're excellent strings, and thank you to D'Addario for sponsoring the podcast. And thank you also to Rob Anzalotti of Bass Capos for providing hosting for the podcast. And Bass Capos are an excellent choice for any bass player looking to use a double bass extension. They're easy to install and adjust, they're cheaper and more reliable than hand-built latches, and they're lighter and quicker to operate. Learn more at basscapos.com. Okay, here we go with our conversation featuring Kevin Brown. I was curious because I looked on your bio and it says that you started at age 3, and I'm thinking, what parent? There's got to be a backstory there.
You know, my mom, both my parents, just really wanted us to, me and my brother, to start playing instruments at a young age, and do the Suzuki method thing.
Yeah.
but she, she's a bass player. She liked low register instruments. She didn't really want to have a violin in the house for 15 years. So, but my brother was older, so he got to play the cello, which was kind of the obvious choice. And she didn't want to have any sort of competition between us. So she wanted me to play viola. And apparently, as a wise 3-year-old, I said no to viola. And so I ended up playing the bass. But yeah, we at the time, now they have instruments of that size. But when I first started, for maybe the first year or two, I was playing actually on a viola da gamba.
Oh,
so it was I think that they it's probably less romantic than I remember. It's probably with electric bass strings or something like that.
Right.
But with those frets, that's the intonation of my life.
It's funny, like, what's a lesson like when you're at that age? I've always wondered, like, my wife used to teach Suzuki harp, and she had a 3-year-old student once, and I was like, what's a lesson like? And she said 15 minutes is the max, and like, if you can get him to like sit in the chair and like pluck one string, it's like lesson. So yeah, I think there might be something to be said for it, maybe starting on something else and coming to it a little later. Seems like a lot of bass players that have found a lot of success, that's what they did, start piano, violin, whatever, and then move over to the bass.
Yeah, well, I think that the other advantage of starting on something like piano, for example, is it improves your reading. I used to struggle with sight reading actually, and I think as part of it was because everything's so slow paced when you're learning the bass when you're young.
Yeah.
Like if you're learning the piano, you're looking at multiple staffs, trying to play multiple notes at the same time. When you're playing violin in youth orchestra, you're playing 10 times as many notes as the bass player. So a lot of what I did growing up wasn't really conducive to learning how to get that kind of fast action, instantaneous sight reading ability.
That's something that I've noticed a lot. I don't know if you've seen that with students, but especially with younger students, they come in and I can almost tell if they've played piano or not, or if they've played something else, especially piano. It's like it almost imprints this intonation blueprint just in their brain or something. Like sometimes I'm wrong, but 9 times out of 10, they'll play a little bit for me. And if I say, "Do you play piano?" And they're like, "Yeah," or like, "Yeah, I did for a few years." And I think that has a huge effect.
Yeah, I think that, no, it's good. In a way, I wish that I had played piano as a child. I never did. I tried to learn a little bit before going to college, and I was just dreadful at piano. I never got advanced at it. It wasn't something that really worked for my hands. It's like the way that I would want to hold my hands. Again, bass posture. I have like a little bit of bend in the wrist, and it felt really unnatural to me to try to flatten it out and spread both hands out like that. It just wasn't a good fit for me at the time that I really needed to try to learn how to do it. But it would have been, I really think that anybody could benefit from having that kind of training early on.
The piano thing is so huge. I mean, like, I've spent so much more of my life, and I don't play piano well at all. Never took lessons until college, but like, I've spent more hours than I can imagine, like in front of a piano, trying to play piano, like for lessons or for rehearsals or that kind of thing, and just to like help for pitch and everything. And yeah, that's like a big regret of mine. I didn't get that going.
Well, the other thing, I think most for young people, we were talking about what a lesson's like for a 3-year-old. Yeah. And I don't remember my own lessons from being 3. I do remember that there was like a little carpet square, and it was like, there's a little circle where you put your end pin, and then this is where you stand. Like, you have little footprints where you'd stand for different situations. So a lot of, I think, what we did was just like, this is how you stand with the bass. This is how you step to the side to bow.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And I remember being at a recital, and one of the younger people was probably 3 years old at the time, maybe I was 8 or 9 or something, came up and got on stage and plucked one open string and then stood up and bowed and had this beaming smile on her face. And I just thought that was kind of cool. It's like, oh, you have this method where you get somebody, whatever level they are, to go up on stage and perform when they're 3. And everybody's like very supportive, and it's just, everybody's just doing their thing at their level and feeling good about it. And I think that that's a big part of it, the advantage of starting people when they are young. And that can work on the bass. I don't know whether that would translate from piano to the bass, whether performance is an abstract or that's integrated, or associated with a specific instrument. Because for me, I haven't had real performance anxiety issues like some of my classmates used to or colleagues have. And I think part of that is because, from the time I was 3 years old, every handful of months I would go out and plucked an open string and it wasn't a big deal.
No, that's such a good point. And that's something I've noticed when I've talked to some other people that started that young. It's like you just get those early wins and just the experience of it just becomes like a part of your life. Did you do Suzuki when you were young? Do you remember or recall like what you worked on the bass?
Yeah, well, I did. My teacher was Christy Connect, who was. She used to live in Northfield, and she would teach viola, cello, and bass Suzuki. Viola, cello, Suzuki, and then the bass stuff was George Vance.
Okay.
So similar idea, but more custom tailored to the bass. So I remember doing that. So when I was there, or when she was there, because she then moved to Kansas City and started focusing more only on the bass. She recently passed away a few years ago. But so I would go through the George Vance books, the very early ones, and at the time, but the cello and viola students were, we'd have recitals, and then there would be sometimes we'd be able to play along in little things or little ensemble pieces that overlapped, but it was it was a different method. But yeah, it was basically Suzuki in terms of thought. She was a Suzuki teacher. She started as a cellist and moved to the bass. Worked with George Vance.
Okay.
From what I understand.
So, yeah, that's interesting, though. So you started, Vance was like a part of your training, like from an early age. And so, like having a professional musician as a parent, like, was there any trepidation about you going into music? I know you started like super young and were playing. I'm sure you were a great player by the time you were relatively young. Was there trepidation or was it an obvious path? How'd that work for you?
It was always just kind of left up to me.
Okay.
I feel like at one point my teacher in high school, Nancy Bjork, she's a teacher in Minneapolis, and I studied with her starting at maybe age 11, somewhere around there, maybe 11, 12. So at one point, I think I was a sophomore in high school, she said to me that if you want to do this, you have the potential if you want to make this into a career. Sometime, it was kind of early high school. She said that, and I just remember going to school the next day and just kind of like looking at my classes and thinking about, what else is there that I might want to do. I had thoughts about my life, but I hadn't really committed to anything. So, and at the end of the day, I just couldn't come up with anything that I'd prefer to do. And then I progressively got more and more passionate about music as I committed to it. I think that my mom, at least, was sort of nervous about my prospects. I started off, I didn't get into the top schools right away, but I had a great teacher. I was studying with Peter Lloyd in early college, and I think that it is kind of nerve-wracking to have your kid go into performance with no backup plan and start taking on a little bit of debt and not really have a guarantee of success. So, I think and she was very aware of how that world works, of how the audition world works, how all that stuff. So, I wouldn't say that it was necessarily an obvious choice that, it was like, well, of course you're going to be a professional bass player. But I think it was like, we'll support this. Yeah, my parents were very supportive.
At what point did you end up at Rice? You finished your undergrad and then did your master's at Rice. Is that right?
I actually transferred. I was at the University of Minnesota for my first 2 years as an undergraduate studying with Peter. And then at that point, Peter went to Northwestern to teach. And at that time, I was able to transfer down to Rice. So yeah, I ended up doing 3 years of undergraduate at Rice, sort of a 5-year. I wasn't in a hurry, to finish, and it was hard to, transferring is kind of a difficult thing. In retrospect, at the time, it was very exciting. I was taking this big step to go down to basically my dream school. But by the time a couple of years had passed, and I'd been really gotten deep into studying with Peter, I wasn't attached to the University of Minnesota, but I was on a trajectory with a teacher. When I started at the University of Minnesota, I was like, oh, maybe halfway through I'll transfer down to Rice or something. I'll try to transfer somewhere else. But by the time that actually came up, it was like something that I wasn't as certain that I wanted to do. But it was just kind of how the cards played out with Peter leaving at that time, and there being this opportunity for me down in Houston. It took some time to adjust to the new environment and the new set of expectations and all that. So yeah, I think that I was being sort of cautious. I decided not to give a recital that year pretty early on, not to kind of manufacture a 5-year undergraduate or, 3 additional years down at Rice, so that then maybe I could get, because otherwise I didn't feel like I could really consider other places for a master's degree, if I had only spent 2 years at each of these places. And it was studying with a new teacher, especially one as unique as Paul. I felt like if I was going to try to finish and do recitals and set up major performances and stuff, and then try to do maybe grad school, it just seemed like it would be a little bit too much, and I'd rather have a lighter schedule for 3 years and be able to really focus on the bass and making progress and figuring out what I was doing.
Yeah, well, because it could be so rushed if you try to do something like that. It seems like if people try to cram that stuff in, like there's just not time for it to there's like a certain gestation period you need to, especially with a transfer like that. What was that like? Just like starting up with Paul. What was he like? How did your playing change? Just maybe any takeaways like that would be interesting.
I was going to say, it was kind of a different value system. I used to say that every time I'd have a lesson with Peter and he'd tell me to do something or try something different, I'd try it and it would work. And then the same thing, like if I'd go and study with Paul, then every time he'd tell me to try something, it would be totally different than what Peter was saying, but I'd try it and it would work. And, it was just a matter of like identifying different things. With Peter, it was very work focused. We did a lot of, again, this part of this is that I was the stage in development that I was. I was, 17, 18, 19 years old. And we had worked together a little bit in high school. But basically, we did a lot of discussion about work habits and creating exercises and practicing and how to structure your practice time. And that was something that was really, really helpful for me going into Rice and going out of Rice. I still approached my practice time the way that I discussed with Peter. And we also talked a lot about making musical choices, but it was always aimed at having something sound the very best that it can right now. Whereas I got down to Rice, and it seemed like Paul was okay with having things not really work now sometimes, if eventually it was going to maybe be somehow better. So, it's sort of a higher pedagogical purpose. And also I don't want that to in any way disparage what Peter does and what he's doing, because again, like it was immensely valuable. And I took those work habits straight to Rice and used them and and everything I was doing was trying to incorporate things, at least for the first, part of the tension is a lot of, that was there the first year that I transferred, was that I was trying to negotiate between these values that I was really firmly attached to, that I had been working on with Peter, and entering a new system and trying to navigate that.
That's so interesting that you frame it that way, because that's something that, like I talked with Robin Kesselman not too long ago, and like I said, talked with Ian and some other, Jory Herman, Sandra Oslin, like a whole bunch of people that have studied with Paul, or like a Paul David Allen Moore, some sort of overlap like that. And the thing that I keep hearing over and over is like this like long-term approach to development. It's like mapping things out, whether it's like skills or like for auditions or whatever, but like looking at something like where it's going to be 3 months in the future, 6 months in the future, a year in the future. I don't know if that resonates at all, but that's like something I remember Robin talking about and some of those other guys.
Yeah, no, I think that's a bbig part of Paul's gift, as a teacher, is that he is able to, part of it's in the admissions process, or he's able, but that translates to week, is that you can see potential, and where something might go in a way that, and that's something that I've really, when I was there, because I was at Rice for 6 years, I did do my master's there as well, so it was really interesting to see who would come through and where it would go, where their playing would go. What is it about someone who starts when is 17? What happens to them in 4 years? what things stay the same, what is possible to transform.
The one-on-one time with that teacher, like in a lesson or a masterclass, whatever, that's so valuable. But then how it's probably the foundation of the educational experience. But like those other people that you're spending your time with in studio, in class, like how much you're getting out of your colleagues, how much you're learning from, and being on a team like that. I mean, that's like such a key factor, and especially like if we're looking at like a college studio, that like. I'm sure working with people like was some of those other, like was Rob, did you overlap with Robin Kesselman or?
I mean, I know Robin, but I was at school with Ian actually, I think for 5 years because we went to USC together too. But yeah, I mean, when I started, the best example is, rep class and studio class and recitals and stuff like that. Those are the most straightforward thing. I started and when I moved down to Rice, it was like I was hearing people like Charlie Nellis and Evan Halloran and Ted Botsford and, people every week playing these excerpts, people who were already making finals of huge jobs. And that was a great way of setting an example, and watching those same people giving recitals was very informative. But a big part of it, I always think, with the exception, sometimes your teacher's around for, you can ask questions in the hallway, or you have lessons once a week for, an hour and a half, and then studio class and rep class. But really, it's only a handful of hours a week that you really get one-on-one time with the teacher. But the rest of the time, if you have a studio that's really involved with each other, that really where everybody's motivated and everybody gets along, and then people play for each other, people talk to each other. I mean, I learned an incredible amount from my colleagues at Rice. So that's where most of the long discussions happen, as you're talking to one of your classmates over drinks or over coffee, or when you're sitting outside in the hallway and just too tired to practice and you need to go back in there, and it becomes what is that called? Like a think tank, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Where people are, and you have a bunch of people who are all thinking about the same things and all coming from different perspectives. But a lot of, and it was nice also to have two teachers at Rice, two bass professors, so that there were a few differing perspectives in that way too. Not contrary perspectives necessarily, but there were a variety of perspectives available in the studio.
There's a saying I like. I forget who originated with, but you're the sum of the five. You're the average of the five people you spend the most time with. And I think about that when I think about what you're describing, like that. Just because how much you learn. I mean, I think back to my own experiences. Like I think probably some of the best moments are like playing for a master class and then going out for drinks with my colleagues and like, what do you think they meant by that? This, or hey, what about this? Think about this, and how much of the learning process actually takes place, I guess, informally, maybe is a word for it. Yeah. Like that.
Yeah, I totally 100% agree. And, I kind of think of it as like the master's students there. I was TA for a while. When I was doing my master's degree there, I was Paul's TA. Mm-hmm. And most of that was just, forwarding emails and I would record the studio classes and make them available and stuff like that. And, it wasn't really about being TA. He encouraged us, the master's students and the incoming people, we'd have this sort of informal mentorship role going on.
Oh, okay.
Where, it's like, every once in a while, one of the freshmen would play for me, or, but they would, he would often refer them to us for questions about why do you think this is, what's the deal with this bowing, and this is, well, why, what's the passage we need to do for up class again? That he would set us up so that there were lines of communication from the most experienced students to the newest ones. By the time that I was out of there, I'd been through the rep class cycle 3 times, and I've been studying with Paul for 6 years.
At what point did you start? And I know you took auditions to get into college, and so you've been taking auditions, for most of your life, probably in some capacity. But if we're thinking like professional auditions or that sort of thing, like at what point did you start to audition for jobs? Was that during undergrad or master's, or when was that?
I started that immediately after my undergraduate.
Okay.
So I've been in college for 5 years. Yeah, I didn't. I took I did the ISB Orchestral Competition the summer before my senior year. Then my first audition was for the Philadelphia Orchestra, which I think was in June of 2010. Right after the school year was over for my senior year, I had 6 weeks or so of free time, and that was my first audition. So, yeah, I took auditions for all of my master's degree. That was the majority of what I did during that time. And then, 4 years later, worked out.
Yeah. Well, and like, obviously there's no secret to winning auditions. I mean, there's no like formula or anything that people can just plug in. It was so fun catching up with David Moore a few weeks ago. And he said, everybody, the comment he made is everybody's searching for the secret. Like you plug tab A into slot B and poof, you got a job. And I know that, obviously that's, right. That's not how it works, but I think it's interesting to just like know people's processes or kind of what changed. Like, how did you, and again, super broad topic, but how did you, from that Philadelphia Orchestra audition and like going forward, how did maybe we could start with your preparation process. Like, how did that evolve over those years?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a long story. When I started with that Philadelphia audition, I think that might have been some of the better preparation I ever did, honestly. I had a wide open time. It was the summertime. I was actually playing on a new instrument for me. I borrowed do you know Paul Cannon?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So he was going away to Paris to study with Francois. So hitting all the
right, exactly.
He was going to study with Francois, and he had a Laborie bass that he was going to be playing that whole year. So he left his orchestra bass. It's a Tenegas. It's very nice. And he left it, and he wanted it to be played, and I needed a nicer instrument to use, and so it kind of was a mutually beneficial thing. Maybe more beneficial for me because I got to play on a nice bass.
Right. Yeah.
So I was learning that, I was using this bass. So, a lot of it was very like repetitive intonation work to try to get used to this. Part of what I also really liked about what I would do for that audition is I had all this time. I would go to my practice space in the morning, and I'd turn on Ein Heldenleben or something that I was working on. That would kind of, as I was doing some stretches and warm-ups, I'd have this music in my head. That was something I also did. I was working at a pizza place before the ISB Orchestral Competition. So I'd walk 20 minutes to work every day. And I put my headphones in and just listen to this music. You just listen to these pieces. And then I'd have them going through my head. This is maybe a little tangent here, but that's one of the things that I really think is different on one side of the screen from the other, is that when you're a student or, when you're preparing an audition, you spend so much time playing music under tempo in fragments at varying tempos or doing exercises related to music. Whereas when you're in a band full time, you're listening to pieces that in real time, you're involved playing pieces in real time all the way through several times a week, all day, every day, in fact, that and you still practice and take things under tempo when you need to, but having a sense of musical flow is something that I feel like is elusive to a lot of people who are struggling in auditions.
Interesting. So you feel like listening to the recordings kind of helped you with that, like you're walking to work and you're getting that music, getting that flow in your brain. You think that was helpful for your prep?
Yeah, well, I do. I think part of it is about like living a musical life, not just being a bass player,
Right.
That before this position, it's weird because the job that I actually won, I don't know if I can recommend a single thing about the preparation that I did, because it was about 2 weeks after, 2.5 weeks after the audition for the Metropolitan Opera. So it was a totally different list. And then I went down to Houston and played a week with the symphony there, and then just kind of, practiced for 5 hours a day, a couple weeks, and then just went for it, So it was, and that's on top of however many years you want to count of preparing that music and preparing to be an auditioner. But what I will say about that is that I think it made me feel a little bit more like I was a traveling performing musician than someone who was fixated on taking this one audition. It was like I went and did a couple performances in New York. I probably had, and then I went down to Houston and played some things, and it was nice to see a lot of familiar faces there too. But it's like I didn't really play for anyone. I didn't, I didn't record myself. I just went and gave a performance from what I've been preparing for years, but also just what I had been able to bring up in the past. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen, but I did my best to perform.
Well, it's great. It's great to hear you say that, because I think people get so fixated, and I put together this book with what I've seen from a few dozen people, but it's that's not a prescription. It's not like, oh, if I don't have 8 weeks completely cleared and I have this and this and do this, I might as well not even take the audition. You're like, and that what you're describing, where you went down and played in Houston and you had just taken an audition, and maybe if you were going to pick the ideal way to prepare, that might not be it. But that reminds me a lot of, I was talking to Jeff Turner years ago about auditioning, and he said something he noticed, because he was the chair of the audition committee at Pittsburgh for a long time. And he said across the board, it's like the people that end up doing really well are the people that are there. They just played a recital, or they were been living, like you described, a musical life. And that's interesting. That very, very similar to what I remember talking about with him.
Yeah, I think that's really a big part of it, and that's why I think a lot of people struggle, myself included, started struggling with auditions as you separate yourself more and more from other things, other musical things you're doing. For about 4 years, that was my musical focus, was trying to take auditions. And I think that there's something to be said that if you're just focusing on auditions, because my big breakthrough was in my last year. I was in Los Angeles, and I had just taken the audition for the LA Phil, and I felt like I had a good chance at that. I had just moved to LA and was studying with David Moore, who was probably was going to be on the committee and really going to know what people want. I've been borrowing this amazing instrument, and I went in and I didn't advance, and I remember being kind of lost after that, because it was like, well, I have all these advantages, and I'm supposed to be good. It's like people would put their faith in me to be good. But in the end, what I decided to do was, the next audition that was coming up was the principal of Atlanta a handful of years ago, and I decided, screw it. I'm only going to meet my own standards. I'm not going to try to play the way that my teachers are suggesting, or that I'm expect that orchestra is going to want to hear, or how it's going to be in that hall. I'm just going to think about what the ideal person, the ideal musician in my mind would do, and do that. And it worked. I went and got a trial in Atlanta. I went through things like reading up on Argentinian songs for Hinastera, and listening to a variety of recordings of different sad love songs that are in the same form as that Hinastera solo. And then I was like, I should watch the entire 1935, I think it's 1935, film that Lieutenant Keisha was written for. And so I went and watched that whole movie and saw where it came up and where that theme came up in a variety of places, and just learning the lyrics to Beethoven 9, and just trying to go above and beyond in ways that nobody had really suggested or said that would really help me in an audition. No one had ever said, the committee is really going to want to hear a lot more joy and brotherhood in this part, but that I wanted to, I was giving a performance that was 100% genuine to my own personal musical values at the moment. I think that's what worked for me there. I got a trial, and then they ended up not hiring anybody, so that's fine too. But yeah, and it's not always going to work out, but that's the only way you can get genuine feedback. I remember after I won this audition in Detroit, I was talking to Alex, and I asked Hanna, and I asked him if he had any advice about the trial, and he said, a lot of people see a trial like this and will come and try to really play principal, and he said, I just came and I was myself, and I just played my part the best I could, just really, really played the part well, and I thought about that, and this is true, I think, in auditions and in trials. But if you have the opportunity, if the opportunity exists for you to be exactly who you are musically and personally, and that's what they hire, then you don't want to blow that opportunity by trying to be something else.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love the way you put that. That reminds me of what Joe Conyer is describing with his Philadelphia. He said, he just deciding to be himself was like the kind of like the mindset shift that worked for him. It's so cool to like just expanding out and doing that research, or maybe you didn't even think of it as research, but kind of like looking at the music more three-dimensionally. That's something that I've always noticed. Like I think back to my time at Northwestern, and I think back to the people on Friday night that were in Regenstein Hall, like just woodshedding. And there were some people that did that. And then there were people that went to see the Chicago Symphony, or they went to see the Lyric Opera. And I fast forward, and it's funny. I've thought about this a lot. Those people that went to see those concerts, those were the people that ended up getting the orchestra jobs or getting the university gigs or something. The people that were just like mindless, or maybe it's not mindlessly, but that were just like shredding, 5 hours every night and just staying in their practice rooms. They either burned out or they didn't land. But I that's something I've noticed time and time again, which is just, I've always found that fascinating.
Totally. And I've been both of those people. I have a real distinctive memory from what I think was a mistake I made with when I was studying with Peter when he was still in the Minnesota Orchestra. And I remember it was probably a Friday night, and we had a Saturday morning lesson or something like that. And he called me and was like, I have a ticket for you for this concert. There's this amazing pianist that's coming, and I don't think that they're going to be coming around many more times. And I can't remember who it was, but it was someone who was probably nearing the end of their career. And I was like, well, it's just I have 3 more hours that I'm supposed to do tonight, and I have this whole plan and this whole trajectory to be able to get my work done in time for the lesson tomorrow, and I really want to play well. I'm feeling a little bit behind. And he was like, well, I'll take it easy on you in the lesson. You should really come see this concert. But, of course, he's also had given me the values.
Yeah.
We've been working on trying to, on my work habits.
Yeah.
So, in the end, I decided not to come and to instead practice. And I'm sure that I played a little bit better in a lesson once, and everything's in a broader context too. It's like, because I didn't take that shift from my work priorities at that time, that was probably surrounded by hundreds of other instances where I didn't blow off my work for something, blow off my practicing for something. So, but it is something that I would think twice about, knowing what I know now.
Well, and like speaking of like what you know now, and again, today's like, I guess the theme of today is like way broad questions. So apologies for this, but no, and you're still a relatively young guy, but like if you could go back to 18-year-old Kevin, let's just say, or you could pick the age, but let's say somewhere around there, What, if you had any advice for him, what might that be?
It's hard because I'm pretty happy with how things worked out for me. Mm-hmm. So, it's hard because I recognize the value in things that I did. I think that, I guess, picking the age, I think that there was a time when I had been taking auditions for a little over a year when I sort of lost perspective on what was that would be probably like 23-year-old Kevin, somewhere around there, where, it was like I felt like what I was bringing to auditions in terms of how much preparation I was doing, how much, how prepared I felt and how well I played didn't really translate to any kind of, or didn't have any correlation with the results I was getting. And that made me feel a little bit complacent about the whole process is such a difficult thing to learn from for that reason, that it's, I think that it's, can be hard for people. I'm glad that I didn't start taking auditions until I was a master's student, because I think that it would be really hard to learn from the process while, still developing. I feel like in some ways taking auditions did sort of stunt my development at that time. And I think that if I had stopped thinking about it in terms of, I need to really try to get a job this year, or if I hadn't ever started thinking about it that way and was just thinking about how can I be the best artist that I can be the whole time, then something probably could have worked out for me sooner, or, not that I don't want anything to be different really from how it is. I'm happy. I really like Detroit. I really like the symphony here. And I'm into this, but there was a time where I just wasn't I wasn't really making that many big steps forward in any ways. I was just kind of going along and getting marginally better and, getting a lot of audition experience. But I think that's something that people kind of put pressure on themselves, myself included. When I was in my master's degree, it was like I didn't know what I was going to be doing next year. I ended up staying for a third year of my master's, and then it was like, well, now I'm in the same position. I don't know what I'm going to do next year. And then I went to USC and was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do in 2 years. There's this kind of pressure that I don't even know if I can just say that we put it on ourselves. Like it's embedded in the system. I had to really actively break free of that. And that definitely wasn't something that, Paul was putting on me or that my parents were putting on me or anything like that. It's just something that I felt like I didn't really have. Part of it was I didn't have a real great instrument of my own, and I didn't have money to make that happen. So I got into a borrowing instruments game, where I was borrowing. First, I borrowed that bass from Paul Cannon, then Paul Ellison let me use his hatches for a few years, and that was great. And then I ended up borrowing a bass from David Moore as well. That I actually bought it now. So I bought that bass. But so now I actually have a bass. I felt kind of bound in that way, that it would be hard for me to start a legitimate freelancing career if I wasn't going to have the best tools to do it. And it was also going to be difficult for me to imagine being really competitive with the instrument that I had in a national audition. So I felt that pressure. I'm saying I felt that pressure for legitimate reasons, but I don't think that it was necessarily productive for my progress as a person or a musician.
Kevin and I also talk about incidental solos in the orchestra and how that's actually the closest Kevin's come to having that audition feeling while actually playing in the orchestra.
In my experience, playing an incidental solo in orchestra is the most similar thing to taking an audition that I've done here. Playing a concerto is a little bit too. It starts off that way, but eventually you have time to settle into a groove. My first year here, we did the Hinestero solo, and we also did Mahler 1 at the end of the season. And Mahler 1, is webcast. So the Hinestero we did in a neighborhood concert, so that came with its own challenges because we did in 4 different spaces, 3 or 4 different spaces. So it was every day, I drive out to the space. It was in the middle of winter too. So it was fun. It was fun though. But you get to that. It gets to that moment, and you have whatever. There's usually a bass solo starts with essentially with silence before it. Then there's a metronome that goes on in your head. It's the timpani or the harp, and then you just have to do it. So again, like maybe the more you can try to be emotionally involved in your auditions, the better setup that is or musically involved at least, the better setup that is for performing incidental solos. For me, it's about preparing them. I think that the best preparation is just kind of watching your colleagues at this point. For me, I watch in Detroit. I watched our principal clarinet player and our principal oboe player and principal cellist and principal or concertmaster and all sorts of other people just walk in and play great every day. And so suddenly it doesn't seem like there's a real. It doesn't feel as much like there's. You could take that the other way, but for me, I feel like it doesn't. It seems like the norm is you show up and you play and it goes well. I think that there's something mental there that that kind of turns around instead of this is an opportunity to embarrass yourself. This is an opportunity to share yourself. Something could happen and it could not go well, but I don't have a routine like some people might where there's a fixed amount of 8 weeks before you start working on your Mahler. It's more like I would practice the intonation and make sure that it's secure with weeks in advance, for weeks in advance, and whatever would feel, starting every day with that and trying to do little performances either for myself or for other people. But mostly it's just I think it's just about surrounding yourself with music that goes well.
Kevin, so great to chat with you for the podcast. Thank you for taking the time. So many great takeaways from this interview. Everyone, that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. I hope you're having as much fun as I am talking to these great artists, learning the things that we're all learning together. Such fun doing this show. And thank you so much for taking your time out of your day to listen to this and follow along. And if you ever want to reach out to me for any reason, feedback at Contrabass Conversations will put you in touch with me. I'd also love it if you connected with this community on Facebook. You can go to contrabassconversations.com/community or just search for Contrabass Conversations in Facebook. But I'm asking weekly questions just about you, your gear, what you're up to. It's a great place to interact, and I'd love to see you there. So thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.